In this video, I'm going to talk about pay-per-views. Is that all we're going to get? Who knows? Let's groove out to the groovy intro and have a well-mannered discussion that'll get no views on YouTube because we're not going to potty mouth anyone. Let's do it. Okay, so now we have about 5 pay-per-views coming up. It's wonderful. We got September 30th, Canelo versus Charlo. That's a good one. If you want to see KSI versus Tommy Fury, I guess there's someone that might want to see that. That's on pay-per-view. Maybe Demetrius Andrade and David Benavidez eventually gets announced. That's been rumored for like 4 or 5 weeks now. If that gets announced, that sounds like that's on pay-per-view. Devin Haney versus Regis Prograis is on pay-per-view. Is there a pay-per-view on... Oh, of course, Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou. That's on pay-per-view. So that's a lot of pay-per-views. And basically, anyone who's relevant, a trendsetter, and making a name for themselves in the sport is on pay-per-view. And then this coincides with rumors of Showtime possibly no longer being in the boxing business in the foreseeable future. Today's press conference, Canelo Charlo, very boring. The most interesting thing I thought was Steven Espinoza gave a lot of facts about Showtime boxing. It almost read like a eulogy of Showtime boxing, contextualized for what we're hearing might be happening. One could interpret that his speech almost was like putting into perspective and putting a capstone on this era of Showtime boxing in the present. But where does that lead us, right? So DAZN is a subscription-based model, but their fights that are on their network now are fighters who are building themselves up or fighters who are in the UK coming on at odd times in the United States, unless it's a fighter like Joshua where they think they can still get you, even if it comes on at a weird time. So they'll still try to put up a paywall if the fight seems interesting enough. But anyone on DAZN that seems like they're a global superstar type fighter is now going to be on pay-per-view. We saw it with Canelo. We're seeing it with Devin Haney. Anyone that they view as viable will be behind a paywall. Showtime, we're not even sure what their dates will be without a paywall. They have no schedule announced. I'm hoping we're going to hear of a schedule announced this week, maybe next week. But I would assume that with this big Canelo fight week, you would get an announcement from Showtime about, hey, here's boxing. But the rumor that's being floated on Twitter by a bunch of people on Twitter, which you can take for whatever that is worth, is basically just saying that Showtime is going to mostly focus on pay-per-view boxing. Those alleged rumors basically stem from the fact that their pay-per-views this year, Ryan Garcia, Tank Davis, Errol Spence Jr., Terrence Crawford, they performed very well. I even think that Benavidez Plant did better than probably expected, and they're outperforming, in my guess, these rumors would say, the regular Showtime Championship boxing. And because of that, the model might be shifting. Now, also add that Paramount, which is their subscription channel, it seems like Showtime is going to merge into the Paramount platform. And so with all of that, that means that change is coming. And the less we hear, the fewer fight dates that are announced, the non-existent fight dates that are announced, well, then the smoke starts to... We start to feel as though there is a fire. You know, we're seeing a little bit of smoke, but is it just what's cooking in the oven, or is it a forest fire? Well, the less we hear, the more we think that the forest is on fire. So, we got that. ESPN has tried with pay-per-views, but they don't really have the viable name right now to get them on pay-per-view. So right now, Top Rank ESPN is looking like the good guy because they are putting on more fights with just an ESPN or an ESPN Plus subscription. You can get the fights, which in this modern era, that's really reasonable because basically everything is a la carte. In 2024, we might be looking at the darkest period of boxing where even though we're getting these great fights, we might be looking at fewer networks involved in the sport of boxing, more fights being put on pay-per-view, and the splintered fan base that we have even more divided because they have to choose based on a financial means what fights they're going to watch, or they have to build a core social group to go and watch these fights at someone's house, or hope that Fathom Events, like this Canelo fight, will host it. It's a big ask of the consumer, right? We don't see the NFL doing this. We don't see the NBA doing this because they have broadcast partners. The big issue with boxing is there are sponsors, but the sponsors often tend to leave the sport because they don't see the value in it. Because for every great fight we put on, here's a stay busy fight, or so on and so forth. Or maybe I just don't understand what I'm talking about, but boxing has been a sport, like my friend Dakota said, where it's, here's the liquor store in a war-torn country, let's loot it and take everything as quick as possible, and then eventually there's a reset. That's the state of boxing. But it feels as though we're closer to fights being on pay-per-view almost exclusively than we are just being able to stumble across a boxing match. What does that mean? That means that the people that go into boxing or find an interest in boxing have to find it on their own, essentially. They're not going to stumble across it. They might stumble across a Tank Davis through their social media threads. They might scramble across a Ryan Garcia. But that entry level now is going to be for the niche and the hardcore fan. You're going to hope that you have a crossover audience because of these paywalls. But what's going to probably happen, in my opinion, if this does happen, is there's going to be some fighters who get very humbled by horrible pay-per-view sales, and the market is going to self-correct and force people back into constraints that work. That being said, we've seen this happen again, and fighters that are used to these great sums of money might not fight. So the pay-per-view era that we're probably heading towards could lead to certain fighters being inactive if they can't get the right dancing partner or right thing, because they don't want to fight for said sums of money. It's a very weird time in the sport of boxing because right now it feels like none of these networks are very invested outside of the place that I'm most invested in, Pro Box TV, cheap plug. ESPN, I'm not sure how invested they are in the Top Rank product. They seem the most involved. DAZN seems like they're just trying to figure out how to be profitable, and boxing is an avenue for them to find a profit margin. But it seems as though they're trying to fill dates with a limited roster, and they can no longer go after those big fights that they were actively pursuing in 2018, 2019. They made it an interesting network and a viable network. Showtime, it looks really depressing what's going on. We're getting a lot of non-answers, and we're getting a lot of loud voices saying it's no longer going to be there. That means one of the biggest promoters in the business, the one that's doing quote-unquote event showings, event viewings, putting on concert-like boxing matches, they're going to be looking for a new home. And that's kind of scary because you don't want one of the bigger promoters to be left without a place to be if that were to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Showtime's going to get reworked and PBC will be there. But the PBC Fox deal was atrocious. Some of the fights that were put on the Fox platform should not have been on that platform. And I feel like this is kind of like the karma. You know how Conor Benn said karma? This is kind of like the karma of some of those really bad Fox fights that were kind of just like, okay, what are serviceable fights? I remember I was at my good friend Mario Bamberger's house once. We were watching a fight in Bakersfield, a FS1 card. And it was just a bunch of like ads, right? There was so many ads, but it was like niche market, and it was like these very, what I would say, accessible ads. And that was troubling. Then the deal goes south, COVID happens, and we're done for. I don't know what to expect as a boxing fan. What I will tell you is, hopefully, I can remain having a job in this industry. Hopefully, we can continue to tell you the truth, and hopefully the consumer, the person who buys these fights, the person who's active, you dictate what happens. So hopefully your voice is heard, and if you don't want these fights to be behind paywalls, speak up. Don't consume certain cards that you don't think are good, and force these promoters to listen to you, because it's been far too long that the consumer hasn't had a voice in these issues. It's been the promoters, managers, and somewhat the fighters behaving as businessmen for their best interests. You as the fan, if you're going to be forced to throw out a lot of money on pay-per-views, speak up and show them, I'm going to be selective. I want the best fights. That's the only way you'll get change. Leave a comment. Give me and subscribe to the channel to help me grow, so then I can just talk down to people and be super arrogant when I'm famous. Okay, I'll see you on the next video.